A very good morning to my dear students. Today we are moving on to the first chapter in the third unit. This is a story written by Hector Hugh Munro, who is popularly known as Saki. Saki is actually his pet name, and he is popularly known in his pet name as Saki. So now we can go to discuss the story, which is entitled as Dusk. Okay, what do you mean by dusk? The title itself has a greater significance here. If we look at the title in another angle, the title suggests something more than usually what it is. Now tell me, what do you mean by dusk? Yeah, the meaning is provided in the textbook itself. What it is? Yeah, the time in the evening when the sun has already gone down and it is nearly dark. So simply we can say that dusk is an evening. Now who can guess the inner meaning? The inner meaning of dusk? Yeah, an evening is actually the time just before night, when there is not that much brightness which the day has. As it is the end of a day, if we take it metaphorically, we can say that it is the last time in an individual's life where there is no color, there is no brightness, there is no hope. Thus, if night can be stood for death, evening can be stood for the last phase of an individual's life before his death. Now let us read the preface passage. Suppose a stranger tells you that he has come to your town for the first time, left his wallet in his hotel room and forgotten the name of his hotel. Would you sympathize with him? So the writer in the preface passage tells us to that, would you sympathize with a man having been forgotten his wallet on his first visit to an unfamiliar place? From this question, the story begins. What do you say? Now tell me, what do you say? Would you sympathize with him or not? Yes, anyway, we can go to the story, what actually happens here in the story. Now I am going to read the first paragraph, so please listen. Norman Godsby sat on a bench in a corner of Hyde Park with his back to a fenced area of grass planted with bushes. It was dusk, about 30 minutes past 6 on an early March evening. The atmosphere was a mixture of failing daylight, pale moonlight, and light from the street lamps a little distance away. The place looked empty, although there were a few people walking silently through the half light or sitting alone here and there on the other benches. They looked like men and women who had lost the battle of life and had come out at this twilight hour hoping, it seemed, to hide their shabby clothes and their drooping shoulders from the curious eyes of their fellow men. So Hyde Park, as given in the textbook, it is actually a famous park in central London. And shabby clothes, the meaning is given there. Shabby clothes mean clothes in bad condition because of having been used too much. And what do you mean by drooping shoulders? Yeah, shoulders that are bent because of weakness or tiredness. So it is better to understand the meaning of these words, then only you will be able to get the meaning of the paragraph thoroughly. Okay, now we can go to the discussion of the first paragraph. In the beginning itself, the narrator invites our attention to a famous park in London where the hero sat on a bench which was placed at one corner behind a fenced area of grass planted with bushes. It was 6:30 on an early March evening. From the next sentence, we get a clear picture about the setting through a powerful use of visual imagery. There was a little sunlight here and there, leaving the glory of sun away, and the depth of darkness or its spreading was quite lessened by pale moonlight and light from the street lamps. Evenings are always marked by loneliness, especially it is with parks. Normally, parks, as you all know, are occupied by various people during the day, and when it comes to night or when it comes to evening, there will be an emptiness. We can't find no people in parks in late evenings and in night. In that way, the place looked empty, but still there were a few scattered around. But still there were some people scattered around here and there. And those who having gone away even after the evening or even after dusk seemed as someone who had lost the battle of life, means someone who proved themselves as failures in their life. In the very next sentence, the writer gives the reason why he considered them as lost people. What is the reason? Because they had come out this evening with a ray of hope. Makes the idea clear that during their entire life they had no hope at all. No hope means no happiness, no contentment, something like that. That is why they came to such parks in order to spend their evenings, and at the same time they regretted to go back to their homes even though it is late evening. And there were those who tried to hide their tiredness or failures from those who always stared at them, or those who always find fault with their life. Or we could say it was all about the society which always pay unwanted attention to their fellow beings' life. So in that way, the narrator gives a clear picture about where the story is going to set. Okay. Now I am going to read the next paragraph. Listen. Godesby's imagination pictured various things about these sad-faced wanderers in the dusk. The poverty, the disappointments in life, the feelings of failure and its possible causes. Okay, when we closely analyze the first paragraph, look at the third sentence. What does it mean? Failing daylight and pale moonlight. Here we can find a transition. What is a transition we can find here? Here the daylight announces the presence of the day. That means glorious years of a man's life, or the young years in a human being's life. And pale moonlight marks the beginning of old age, where there is hopelessness and loneliness. So, this suggests the transition of an individual's life from the young days where there is hope, happiness, cheerfulness, everything, to that of his or her olden days where there is no hope, there is no happiness, there is no cheerfulness. In that way, the opening of the story itself is written in highly poetical language, where the writer beautifully and impressively presents everything in a highly poetical manner. Their poverty, their disappointment, their feelings of failures, their hopelessness, their unhappiness, their loneliness, everything. So now I am going to read the next paragraph. Listen. On the bench by his side sat an elderly gentleman with the expression of a defeated person who refused to admit his defeat. His clothes were not quite shabby, but they were neither very expensive nor new. As he got up to go, Gatsby imagined him to be a man in whom no one was particularly interested either at home or outside. As his figure disappeared slowly into the shadows, his place on the bench was taken almost immediately by a young man, fairly well dressed but not more than cheerful than the man who had sat there before. As if to emphasize the fact that he was deeply troubled and unhappy, the newcomer uttered a curse or two as he threw himself into the seat. Now listen. Gatsby speaks of the first person who sat next to him on the stone bench. He says that the man looked as a defeated one who never admitted that he was a defeated one. His clothes were not that much shabby. That means, he was not that much a failed one. And the dress he wore was not expensive and new as such. As he was about to leave the place, Gatsby assumed that he was a man who was neither accepted by the society nor at his home. As his figure disappeared slowly into the shadows, look at the sentence. This is what I mentioned in the beginning, how beautifully and poetically it is written, or how beautifully and poetically the writer presents every detail in its minute level. Instead of saying that the first man left the place, he poetically and beautifully presented that his figure disappeared slowly into the shadows. A language which we can only find in poems. Now let us come back. As he had left the place, another man took his place who dressed fairly well, but at the same time not more cheerful than the previous man. He was troubled and unhappy and was murmuring something as he threw himself into the seat. He was speaking something to himself while he was taking the seat. Okay. Now listen. I am going to read the next part. You don't seem in a very good temper, said Gatsby, judging that he was expected to show some sympathy. In a sympathizing manner, Gatsby mentioned that you seemed as if you are not in a good temper. Then the young man turned to him with a look of great frankness, which put Gatsby instantly on his guard. What do you mean by on his guard? Yeah, the meaning is given there. Became careful and prepared for something difficult. Yeah, suddenly the young man turned to Godspy and started saying frankly, which put Godspy under pressure. You wouldn't be in a good temper if you were in the trouble I'm in, he said. I have done the silliest thing I have ever done in my life. Yeah, the man remarked that you said that I seemed as if I am not in a good temper. Yes, surely I am not in. And he added that you wouldn't be in a good temper if you were in my position. You would not also be in a good temper if you were in my position. Okay. Yes, said Godspy without much enthusiasm. Now listen, I am going to read the next part. I came up to London this afternoon, intending to stay at the Patagonian Hotel in Berkshire Square, continued the young man. When I got there, I found that the hotel had been pulled down some weeks ago and a cinema theatre had been put up in its place. The taxi driver recommended me to another hotel some way off and I went there. I just sent a letter to my people giving them the address and then I went out to buy some soap. I had forgotten to pack any and I hate using hotel soap. Then I strolled about a bit, had a drink at a bar and looked at the shops, and when I thought of turning my steps back to the hotel, I suddenly realized that I didn't remember its name or even what street it was in. Now that is a nice situation for a fellow to be in who hasn't any friends or connections in London. Of course, I can write to my people for the address, but they won't get my letter till tomorrow. Meanwhile, I am without any money. Came out with only a shilling on me, which went in buying the soap and the drink. So here I am, wandering about with 2 pence in my pocket and nowhere to go for the night. Then the man narrated his present situation. He remarked that while his way to Patagonian Hotel in Berkshire Square, he realized that the hotel was completely destroyed, pulled down. What do you mean by pulled down? Yeah, destroyed completely. So he realized that the hotel was completely destroyed and a movie theatre had been put up in its place. Then the taxi driver redirected him to another hotel, and after sending his address to his people, he went out to buy some soap and he wandered about a bit, drank at the bar. So strolled here means, then I strolled about a bit. Strolled here means, yeah, wandered a bit. Wandered a bit. When he decided to move back, he realized that he didn't remember its name or even the name of the street as well. And even if he wrote something to his friends, they would not get it till tomorrow. Meanwhile, he was not having money as he came out with 1 shilling, and that was spent towards the purchase of soap and the drink at bar. In that way, now he is wandering with 2 pence and nowhere to go for the night. Now listen, I am going to read the next part. Listen. There was a meaningful pause after the story had been told. I suppose you think that I have made up an impossible cock and bull story for you, said the young man presently in a hard voice. Not at all impossible, said Godspy carefully. I remember doing exactly the same thing once in a foreign city, and on that occasion there were 2 of us, which made it even more remarkable. Luckily, we remembered that the hotel was on a sort of canal, so when we came across the canal, we were able to make our way back to the hotel. When the story had been told, there occurred a silence, a meaningful silence, as if he wanted to express something, and then he continued by saying that you may think that I made you fool with a fabricated story. No, he said carefully. That means Godspy spoke very seriously by paying respect to the young man's comment. Godspy continued by saying that he too had a same experience. Then he shared that and recollected how they managed to overcome the situation. Okay. Now listen, I am going to read the next part. The youth brightened a little on hearing this. In a foreign city, I wouldn't mind so much, he said. One could go to one's consul and get the required help from him. Here in one's own land, one is far more helpless if one gets into a fix like this. Unless I can find some decent chap to swallow my story and lend me some money, I seem likely to spend the night on the bank of Thames. Thames is actually the name of a river in London. I am glad, however, that you don't think the story totally improbable. When Godspy uttered a word like foreign in his comment, the young man said that there wouldn't be any problem if it happened in a foreign place, as there would be the service of a consulate to provide them any help if they needed. But when such a situation is happened to one in his own land, things would be entirely different, unless he could find someone who could believe his story completely and lend him some money. Anyway, the young man was glad and grateful, as Godspy did not find fault with the story, or he believed him completely. Now we can go to the next part. He threw a great deal of warmth into the last remark. What was the last remark? Yeah, I am glad, however, that you don't think the story totally improbable. He threw a great deal of warmth into the last remark, as if perhaps to indicate his hope that Godspy himself might be such a decent chap. Decent chap means decent fellow being. The young man hoped that Godspy would be such a man whom he could expect some help. Now listen, of course, said Godspy slowly, the weak point of your story is that you can't show me the soap. The young man sat forward hurriedly, felt rapidly in the pockets of his overcoat, and then jumped to his feet. I must have lost it, he muttered angrily. Now let us go to discuss the things in detail. Yeah, of course, Godspy said. Godspy found a fault with the young man. What was the fault? Yeah, Godspy said that, there is a weak point in your story. And what is a weak point in his story? Yeah, that you lack the main evidence. You lack the presence of soap. You lack the soap with you. Then the young man in hurry went in search of the soap in his pocket and muttered angrily that he must have lost it. Now listen, to lose a hotel as well as a cake of soap on the same afternoon suggests willful carelessness. What do you mean by willful carelessness? Yeah, something which we have done purposefully, said Godspy. But the young man did not wait to hear the end of this remark. This remark means the remark that he made that it was willful carelessness. He hurried away down the path, his head held high with an expression of well-practiced anger and pride. Now, Godspy mentioned that Losing a hotel and a soap as well is something purposefully. It couldn't be believable. The young man did not pay attention to his remark. Instead, the young man went hurriedly away down the road with a well-practiced anger and pride. So the young man was in great anger when God's spy made a comment that it was willful carelessness. Now let us move on to the next part. It was a pity, thought God's spy to himself. The bit about going out to buy one's own soap was the one convincing part of the whole story, and yet it was just that little detail that brought him to grief. If he had the brilliant forethought to provide himself with a newly bought cake of soap, he would have been a genius in his particular profession. In that profession, genius certainly consists of an endless ability to take precautions. According to God's spy, the same bit was the convincing part, and at the same time, it was the detail that made him fail completely, or that made him a complete failure. If he had a professional geniusness, he would have taken some precautions against being caught up or being suspected by others, or he would have planned something better than this. Now listen, let us move on to the next part. With these thoughts, God's spy rose to go. As he did so, he gave a cry of surprise and anxiety. Lying on the ground by the side of the bench was a small packet whose covering showed without doubt that it was a newly bought cake of soap. It had obviously fallen out of the young man's overcoat pocket when he threw himself down on the seat. In another moment, God's spy was rushing along the half-dark path, anxiously looking for a youthful figure in a light overcoat. He had nearly given up the search when he caught sight of the young man standing uncertainly on the border of the road, evidently trying to decide which way to go. When God's spy called him, he turned sharply with an expression of challenge. "The important witness to the truth of your story has now appeared," said God's spy, holding out the cake of soap. "It must have slipped out of your overcoat pocket when you sat down on the seat. I saw it on the ground after you left. You must excuse my earlier disbelief, but appearances were really rather against you. And now, if the loan of a sovereign is any good to you." Now, listen. When God's spy rose with a suspicious thought on the young man, accidentally he soon found the soap fallen on the ground. Then what did he do? Suddenly he rushed in search of the young man and found the young man on the border in a dilemma which way he had to go. When God's spy called him, he misunderstood him. Why he misunderstood him? The young man thought that he just came there for some other arguments. So when the young man saw God's spy there, he got himself ready for another argument in order to resist God's spy's point of view. Then God's spy informed him that he was not there for any arguments. Instead, he came there as he had found the main evidence, and then he excused himself for his disbelief over the young man and offered him money and his soap as well. Now let us move on to the next part. I am going to read the next part. Listen. The young man replied by taking the coin and hastily pocketing it. Here is my card with my address, continued God Spy. You can return the money any day this week. And here is the soap. Don't lose it again. It has been a good friend to you. Lucky thing, you are finding it, said the youth, and then, as if finding it difficult to speak, he uttered a word or two of thanks and hurried away in the direction of Knightsbridge. Now, what happens here? Then God Spy gave his address to the young man and said to him that he could return the money any day that week. So, for returning the money, God Spy actually gave his address. And at the same time, God Spy reminded him not to lose the soap, which actually saved his life. So, in that way, the young man had it with gratefulness and moved against Knightsbridge. Poor boy, he nearly broke down, said God Spy to himself. I am not surprised. It must have been such a great relief to him. It's a lesson to me not to be too clever in judging people by circumstances. Now, when the boy just left, God Spy felt pity on the young man, and at the same time he felt contempt over his over judgment on people by circumstances. As God Spy walked back to his seat in the park, he saw an elderly gentleman looking and feeling with his hands beneath the bench and all around it. God Spy recognized him as the man who had sat there before the young man. Have you lost anything, sir? He asked. Yes, sir, a cake of soap. So, at this note of greater twist, the story ends here. So, the writer here adds an unexpected ending to the story. When God Spy was back to the place where he sat, he found the first man whom he had sat with. Then he politely asked the man, Have you lost anything, sir? Then the man replied, Yes, sir, a cake of soap. At this note, the story ends here. So, here the story took a great diversion at the end, which we even didn't think of and expect. Thus, the story ends at the point where God Spy got fooled. So, in that way, the last part of the story clearly depicts that Norman God Spy was right. Why we say so? In the beginning, Norman God Spy was quite doubtful about the young man. And when the story ends, it is proved that all his doubts were true and all his doubts were worthy. And at the same time, it is also proved that the young man was a genius in his particular profession, and at the same time he had an endless ability to take precautions. So, this is all about the chapter. So, before going to wind up, you have to note these things. You have to write down all the difficult and unfamiliar words in the notebook along with their meanings. So everyone should write all the unfamiliar and difficult words in your notebook along with their meanings. And in the next section we will discuss the question answer part. So this is the time to wind up. Anyway, thank you. Have a nice day.